Perfect. So first of all, just wanted to say thank you to Darren for reaching out to me a few weeks ago to get this set up. He described our background. We've gone back about 5 or 6 years here, and definitely have a mutual interest in all things track and field, speed, biomechanics, that sort of thing. Really excited to present to this group, and wanted to say thank you to you guys for your time and attention today. Always enjoy doing these sort of presentations. Quickly going to give a shout out to the friends, colleagues, mentors I've had along the way. I'm not going to name each of them one by one, but did my PhD at Southern Methodist University in Dallas with Dr. Peter Wayne and Dr. Larry Ryan, and certainly they've been huge influences on me as mentors as it relates to biomechanics and applied physiology. My own personal background, just very briefly. So actually, I do not come from a track and field background. I was a small college running back in American football. So got interested in speed development from that background, was just always trying to get faster and became interested in the science of it. I do come from a coaching background. So after graduating from college, I was a strength and conditioning coach in all levels, from high school all the way up to professional level, working with athletes of all backgrounds, from team sports to track and field. And gradually my interests gravitated from kind of team sport athletes primarily to sprint mechanics and track and field. In 2010, I moved down to Dallas, which is in the southern part of the United States, in Texas, to do my PhD in the SMU Locomotive Performance Lab. I was there for 5 years. It was an incredible experience in one of the nation's best labs for looking at running biomechanics. And we tested everybody from Olympic medalists, gold medalists, including in the sprints and hurdles and jumps, all the way down to average Joes and everybody in between. And all we did was look at what makes fast people fast and slower people slow. And it was a great 5-year period for me as far as growth of my knowledge. And then in 2016, I moved back, or 2015, to the Philadelphia area, which is in the northeast part of the United States. And I took my current role, and as Darren mentioned, I teach biomechanics and motor learning and kinetic anatomy at Westchester University. And I'm also a sprints coach. I work with the speed and power athletes for our track team. We're a Division II track team in the United States. So we're kind of middle of the road. We certainly don't have any elites, but it's a great way for me to keep my hand in teaching, research, and coaching. And I really enjoy the hybrid role in which I operate right now. So last little piece of my background: since 2017, I've been a consultant working alongside Dr. Ralph Mann on the USA Track and Field High Performance Program, working with our internationally competitive sprinters and hurdlers. We don't work with the jumpers per se, but we do some analysis. We don't work on the technical aspects of the jumps, I should say, but we do some technical analysis of their sprinting mechanics. And that's been, just a great avenue for me as well to work with athletes at the highest level. So presentation overview, we'll just kind of briefly dive into the reasons for training max velocity. I think we're all pretty much schooled on that. Darren showed that slide, which I'll actually show again. I mean, it's crucial for our jumping performance. We'll get into the science of max velocity, and that will take up a large part of the middle portion of our presentation. And then we'll get into some practical applications for ways to apply what we just discussed from a scientific standpoint. So with that, I'll just dive right in. And I think it's first to define max velocity mechanics, and then differentiate that from peak velocity. So if we look at competitive sprinters, and yes, I realize this is an audience of jumpers and jumps coaches, but I think this is a good place to start. We all have kind of seen this classic velocity versus distance curve. So here we have distance in meters on the x-axis, and velocity not in meters per second, but just in percentage of max velocity on the y-axis. And depending on which sprinters you're looking at, and male versus female, and their talent level, you're going to see that for most competitive sprinters in a 100-meter dash, they hit peak velocity, 100% of max velocity, somewhere between 45 and 65 meters. Obviously, for a guy like Usain Bolt, that might actually happen a tiny bit later in his fastest race, but generally we're at 50 to 60 meters or somewhere in that zone. And so I think sometimes people in track and field or just in speed development, in general, think, well, if I'm training max velocity or working on max velocity, I need to get out to 60 meters to really touch upon that. And although that's true, to actually hit a peak velocity, I think it's important to look at this curve on a percentage basis. So if we look, these athletes are already well above at 30 meters, they're well above 90%, upwards of 95% between 30 and 40 meters. And so I think it's key to keep those numbers in our mind as we kind of look at velocity profiles, perhaps as it relates to a jumper. I mean, athletes are going to be perhaps not at peak velocity, but at very high percentages of maximal velocity earlier than 60 meters. Great article for those that are interested is by Ryu Nagahara and colleagues. And this was really the first to come out from his research group. They've published a large number of articles from this same data collection setup over in Japan. They've got 50 meters of force plates and synchronized motion capture. It's really a unique data collection setup globally. There's nothing else like it. We're going to take a look at a video here, and these are sprinters, so let's keep that in mind. This athlete's doing a 40-meter sprint. It's not a jumper per se, but there's a lot we can gather here just from the general mechanics of an accelerated sprint into top speed. And Ryu posted this video to social media a few months ago, so it is out there in the social media universe if you want to go check it out. But we'll just watch this a couple of times through. You can see the athlete accelerating. I'm going to talk through what we see. So in the upper right-hand panel, the graph is just velocity in meters per second. In the middle right-hand panel, we have step frequency in steps per second. And in the lower right-hand panel, we have step length in meters. And then in the upper left-hand panel, we have the forces that are being applied. So the red force waveforms are the vertical forces, and then the blue forces, the blue waveforms are the braking and propulsive forces. So you can see that there's kind of a negative braking horizontal force, and then as the athlete transitions into the second half of each ground contact, there's a propulsive horizontal force. We'll watch this one more time. And we can see that as the athlete transitions from the initial steps into kind of a transitional acceleration here into approaching top speed, that the ground contact times get shorter, the vertical forces there in red get larger, the body becomes more upright. And if we look at the panel on the right-hand side, I want to point out really one thing. The step frequency becomes very quick, very early on in the sprint. And although this accelerative pattern might be slightly different in our jumpers and their approach, step frequency does get pretty quick, pretty early on. And so how do we apply big forces in short contact times becomes a really key challenge as the athlete approaches maximal velocity. That'll be a theme that we come back to. So one other thing to note from this study, and again, I do want to point out that this was done in sprinters accelerating in a sprint and not necessarily specific to jumpers on the runway per se, but I think there are a lot of biomechanical factors that translate. If we look at velocity in raw meters per second here on the y-axis, so some of the athletes in this study were not elite sprinters, but they were fast. They could hit 10 meters a second. So we can see the step number on the x-axis and velocity on the y-axis. Again, if we look at that as far as percentage of max velocity, we can see that by steps 16, 18, 20, 22, these athletes are near max velocity. And so if we kind of put these as kind of in terms of perhaps where a long jump approach would be, the athletes are reaching a very high percentage of their maximum velocity. So this data from sprinters on that, lab runway translates nicely with what Darren has presented, and I'm going to come back to that slide momentarily. I think there's a kind of a nice coherence of the findings here. So again, stealing directly from Darren's slides here, clearly, one of the major factors in jump distance and flight distance, no matter how you look at it, is the velocity at takeoff. Of course, both the horizontal and the vertical velocity, but the incoming sprint velocity is going to be a large contributing factor, which is, one of the reasons why reviewing these contributing determinants is so important. And then, figuring out how we can improve that. And I just love these numbers that Darren showed on the previous slide. So we can see kind of from 10 years of data, and this is data that Darren has gathered and presented on before. Typically, the velocities that elite jumpers need to hit for men in the long jump, somewhere between 10.5 and 11. For women, somewhere between 9.3 and 9.5. We can see the corresponding velocities in the triple jump for males and females. And then, what they actually hit in the event versus perhaps what they're capable of. Well, in just a straight sprint, it's a really high percentage, right? Upwards of 97 or 98%. What that tells me is that, hey, it's all about bumping up the ceiling. If we can improve their maximum velocity in a straight sprint, if we can raise that ceiling by 2 or 3%, then hopefully we're going to be able to raise what they're actually doing in competition. And that's obviously going to have beneficial effects on their jump distance, which is, of course, what we're all going for. So to me, one of the limiting factors or major determining factors is max velocity. We know that what they're going to do in competition is going to be a very high percentage of what they're capable of. Therefore, the conclusion is if we can raise that ceiling, it's, of course, going to have a beneficial effect on the jump performance overall in competition. So that kind of sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about today. Why are we focusing so much on improving maximum velocity? Just to hit this point one more time, I think it's important that we define max velocity mechanics, what somebody looks like when they're approaching max velocity versus peak velocity in like a 100-meter dash. We've already discussed what peak velocity is, at 60 meters, the instant in time when the runner hits their fastest velocity. Well, if we look at just a transitional acceleration, and this data and these stick figures are taken from the Nagahara paper, which again was on sprinters, not on jumpers, but I think the general concepts transfer here. We're going to see that the initial portion of the acceleration phase is going to have longer ground contact times, shorter flight times. The runner's obviously going to have a forward lean, and the force vector is going to be angled forward. They're going to lean forward to push down and back so that the action-reaction forces project them up and forward. As the runner gets into their transitional acceleration, the contact times become shorter, the flight times become longer, the body becomes more upright, and the force vector becomes more vertical. It becomes increasingly difficult to apply large forces in short ground contact times. And then as the athlete approaches top speed, and this is typically going to be, a high percentage of top speed in step 14 and beyond, the ground contact times get very short. The flight times are a little bit longer, typically 0.12 seconds plus or minus a little bit. The body posture is nearly upright, and the resultant force vector is very much vertical. And if you go back and you look at the IAAF data from the 2017 biomechanics report, as the athletes approach the board, I believe the third step prior to takeoff, the ground contact times were very fast. I didn't put that information on this slide, but I think you can go back and reference that. And for many of the competitors, the contact times were near 90 milliseconds. So very, very short ground contact times as the athlete nears their top speed in the approach of the jump. So that's kind of a good way of looking at things. Again, peak velocity may occur as late in a sprint as 40 to 70 meters in a 100-meter race, depending on the athlete's ability. But upright max velocity mechanics and good max velocity mechanics should be and will be observed in the horizontal jump events. We'll talk a little bit more on this concept later on in the presentation. So next thing is just kind of 2 additional slides on why we want to put a heavy emphasis on training top speed. So max velocity training is a great stimulus. It presents the largest forces and the shortest contact time of any training exercise. This is an image from Derek Hansen, image presented with permission here. And we can just see, if we walk our eyes from right to left on this graphic, we can see the ground contact times of a bunch of different movements. So just from walking, where the ground contact times are 0.6 seconds, to depth jump landings, where it's typically about 0.3 seconds, to doing various types of other plyometrics like hurdle jumps, to acceleration, and then all the way into top speed sprinting. So the forces may not be as big in sprinting, top speed sprinting, as in jumping, but the rate of force, in other words, how much force, how quickly, is going to be where the stimulus lies. So for sprinting, the fastest sprinters are applying nearly 5 times of peak force times body weight, 5 times body weight of peak force in less than 1/10 of a second. So that rate of force application is going to be a great training stimulus. Likewise, top speed training may serve as a stimulus for decreasing the risk of injury. Again, we can never say eliminating the risk of injury, but just decreasing it. I think more and more research is coming out within the last 5 years that doing top speed training as part of an integrated training program serves to, vaccines, a bad word choice here, but given the global events, but I think it is appropriate to what we're discussing, I guess, in this context, as a potential vaccine for hamstring injury. So certainly including high-speed sprinting, not just from a performance standpoint, but as a way to potentially decrease the risk of injury in your jumpers is an important point to look at as well. These need to be integrated training strategies, of course, with everything else you're doing in the weight room, obviously, between perhaps RDLs or stiff-legged deadlifts, Nordics, etc. So now that we've kind of established, hey, these are the performance factors in the jumps, and obviously maximum velocity is a huge critical factor in the jump distance. What's the biomechanical underpinnings of that? So in very simple terms, what allows some people to be faster than others? Well, let's start with this basic concept, and I like to call this ground contact geometry. And we're going to watch a competitive sprinter. This guy wasn't an elite, but his PR was 10.44 in the 100-meter dash, so he was pretty fast. And we'll just watch this play through a little bit. Here he's just doing a 60-meter dash, and we're just timing one of his middle segments and getting some simple kind of kinematic parameters. We can look at what I would term the contact excursion angle. So this is the total angle swept by the leg during the ground contact phase. If you just draw on a line from where the ball of the foot strikes the ground, the center of pressure, basically through the hip, that's going to be essentially the runner's leg length at both touchdown and toe off. So this angle that leg sweeps through is going to be the contact excursion angle. That's typically somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees. Typically 55 degrees plus or minus a little bit. For those of you that are geometry nerds, you'll know that 1 radian is 57.3 degrees. It turns out to be just about that in most runners, plus or minus a little bit. The contact distance, which is the distance traveled by the runner's center of mass during the ground contact phase, this ends up usually about equal to the runner's leg length because of this geometry of ground contact. For most runners of average height, typically most males, this will be roughly equal to leg length, which is roughly equal to 1 meter. So it'll be 0.9, 0.95, 1 meter, something in that range. A little bit less for females, but the concept remains the same. This contact distance is going to be roughly 1 meter. So if we make a simplifying assumption and ignore air resistance, which we can safely do, it's not going to have a huge effect, then speed, we all know that speed is stride rate times stride length. We can redefine that as contact distance divided by contact time. Contact distance is in meters, contact time is in seconds. And since that contact distance is going to be roughly 1 meter for most runners of average height, this means that speed can only increase if contact time decreases. So it's a pretty simple relationship. To run faster, the ground contact times have to get shorter. That would be within a course of an accelerated run, the contact times are basically going to decrease step to step to step. That could be if you're looking at two runners of different top speeds. Generally speaking, if runner A and runner B are of the same dimensions, the one that has the faster top speed is going to have the shorter ground contact time. And we can just kind of see this with some theoretical numbers in the table. The faster the top speed, the shorter the ground contact time. And even though those are theoretical numbers, experimental research and numerous studies has kind of demonstrated this fact. The faster the speed and the graph on the right-hand side, as speed increases in meters per second, contact time in seconds on the y-axis has to decrease. So that's a fundamental concept that we need to keep in mind. Ground contact or contact distance is about a meter. Therefore, contact time has to decrease for speed to increase. Now, when we get into the forces, this is where vertical force comes into play. Runners always have to apply enough impulse. Impulse is the product of force and time. So runners always have to apply enough impulse during a ground contact phase to support their body weight. That's just simple physics. If they don't apply enough impulse to support body weight, their center of mass is going to go down. They're going to, sink into the ground, if you will. But we've already established that as speeds increase, contact time decreases. Therefore, to meet the necessary vertical impulse requirements, as contact times get shorter, as speeds get faster, that means that the average vertical force that's applied to the ground during the contact phase needs to go up. So it leads to this pretty simple relationship that we can look at here, and this is supported by Dr. Peter Weyand's research from 2000 and 2010, is that as speed increases, and we see speed on the x-axis in meters per second, we need shorter ground contact times. And as ground contact time decreases, to get that necessary vertical impulse, the runner needs to apply larger vertical forces. So these are kind of our foundational rocks. Faster top speeds, shorter contact times, larger vertical forces. This also means that faster speed requires a greater rate of vertical force application. It's not just how much vertical force, it's how much vertical force, how fast. So we're going to keep this in mind and come back to this throughout the course of the presentation. So if we look at some example numbers, and these are hypothetical, kind of theoretical numbers, but they are based on competition type of values for an average sized male, a male who's 1.78 meters and 75 kilos. And we can just kind of draw some correlations across the speed. So if you take an athlete across the speeds, I should say, in kind of talent categories, if you take an athlete who's got a very below average top speed for a male athlete, 9 meters per second, which in the track and field world is a turtle. So 10-meter fly time is equivalent to 1.1 seconds. Their ground contact time is going to be about 0.11 seconds. Every single time they hit the ground, it's going to be about 0.11. The average force, the average vertical force applied with each step at top speed is going to be about 2.1 times body weight. So if they're about 90 kilos, or sorry, 78 kilos, 75 kilos, I should say, 2.1 times that is going to be what their average force is. Sorry, I'm used to dealing in pounds here. If we go up to the good category, top speed of 10 meters per second, 10-meter fly time of 1 second, contact times are going to be just a little bit shorter, 0.1 seconds on the ground. Average force, just 2.2 times their body weight. So just a little bit of an increase from the below average category. We take a step up to national class. So somebody who can hit 11 meters a second. For a sprinter, that'd be national class, but not world class. For a jumper, that would be world class, right? So this is kind of what we're looking for. So 11 meters a second, 10-meter fly would be, somewhere around 0.91. The contact times would be about 0.091. And in fact, if you go back and look at the IAAF data from the 2017 report, I believe that's exactly what you see. Average force normalized to body weight about 2.3. And then world-class sprinter, and again, maybe these aren't the athletes that we're dealing with from a jump standpoint, but just for context here, 12 meters a second, Contact times 83 milliseconds, 0.083 seconds, 2.4. What's the big picture? A little bit of extra vertical force goes a long way, right? We're talking tenths of a body weight is what's needed to support a full meter per second of increase in speed. And just a little bit of a decrease in ground contact time goes a long way. So taking your runner from, a contact time of 0.100 seconds to 0.091 seconds is going to allow them to go from 10 meters a second to 11 meters a second. Average force of 2.2 to 2.3. That's really the bandwidth that we're dealing with for your athletes. Those are the margins that we're looking at. Now, easier said than done, of course. It's easy to put it on a bar graph like this and say, hey, just get 9 milliseconds faster. We know that in practice that's a lot harder to get those type of improvements. But those are kind of the categories and the groupings that we're looking at. If you can get a decrease in contact time of 5 milliseconds, 0.005, that's going to lead to a huge improvement in top speed for your athletes. Okay, so these are some videos that were taken at the SMU Locomotor Performance Lab when I was a doctoral student. These videos are about 7 or 8 years old, but they age well. How do faster athletes apply more force in less time? And I want to give a shout out to the lab director there, Dr. Peter Wayne, and Dr. Larry Ryan, who's the research engineer who created these videos. We're going to look at 2 examples. One's a competitive sprinter at 11.2 meters per second. And then the next video is going to be a miler or maybe a team sport athlete. But the point is for contrast here. Okay, so this first video that we're going to watch, I want to provide context. On the x-axis of this graph, we have time in seconds. On the y-axis, we have force in pounds. Forgive me, this is in English or American, made for an American demonstration video, but should be in newtons, I suppose. But you can see the point of this is we have forces applied to the instrumented force treadmill. Every time the runner's foot hits the ground, we see these spikes showing up. We're going to look at the smaller spikes first. The smaller spikes represent the braking followed by the propulsive component. So where you see a negative little spike, and then as the runner's center of mass translates in front of the foot, we see a positive component. Those are the anterior posterior braking forces. Those are important, but for our purposes, we're mostly going to focus on the vertical forces. The bigger spikes that you see spiking at about 900 pounds, those are the vertical forces. So we see peak vertical forces that are about 4 to 5 times body weight. This athlete weighed 180 pounds. So he was right around 75 kilos, I believe, with 900 pounds of peak force. That's peak force of 4 to 5 times body weight. We had ground contact times for this athlete of less than 1/10 of a second, similar to what we just talked about. And we can see that in this 1 second of time on the x-axis, he's getting in 5 ground contacts, so 5 steps per second, basically. And then what we can see is this really fast rising edge to the vertical force curve. We can see that in contrast to the upside down shaped U, which I'll present on the next slide, this kind of has a sharp spiking rising edge, and that's representative of a very high rate of vertical force application. Now, let's keep this image in mind as we look at what we term an athletic non-sprinter. This athlete was moving at 9 meters a second, so not slow, but of course, not fast for our purposes for a male athlete. And we can see the similar graphic, time in seconds on the x-axis. I would direct your attention that the y-axis is scaled differently, only 600 pounds at the top of the y-axis here. And we can note that the peak forces are much less, only 3 times body weight for this athlete. He weighed 165 pounds, only 3 times body weight for peak force. The ground contact times, although it's a little bit hard to see here, were 0.12 seconds. And we know that a little bit longer contact time leads to a lot slower top speed. And where I really want to direct your attention is the shape of the vertical force curve. So this is much more like an upside down U. It lacks that fast rising edge, that jagged edge to the force curve. This is what we would term basically your classic spring mass model. Good for kind of passive storage and return of elastic energy, not so good for top speed sprinting. So this is going to be characteristic of people who are slower than 10 meters per second in males, 9 meters per second in males. It's an okay way to run if you're going out for like a 1500, but not so good for hitting 11 meters a second. So ground contact time and vertical force, and this was one of the manuscripts that came out of this data set. Again, if we kind of do the averages, we look on the right-hand panel, the athlete non-sprinter at around 9 meters a second is going to have this upside down U, this kind of classic sine wave type of force trace. The competitive sprinter on the left is going to look different. What's interesting is we've already established that faster runners apply a greater rate of vertical force application, but it's not coming in the second half of ground contact. The second half of ground contact is actually nearly identical in competitive sprinters and their slower counterparts. It's somewhat counterintuitive. It's not that classic Google image, the second half of the push-off that's important once you're up to speed. Where all the difference lies is in how you strike the ground in the first half of ground contact, how you wind up and strike and apply force really in the first 0.03 seconds, how much force you can apply. How is that being accomplished? So keep this image in mind. This is where the big difference lies as far as the rate of force application. And we're going to come back to this graphic a little bit later on. Now let's take a little bit of a sidestep and look at the motion of the limbs and how this is setting up that ground contact. So really 30 years of research at this point, dating all the way back to the 1990s, has shown that thigh angular motion is really crucial for speed. Thigh angular velocity and thigh angular motion is really crucial for top speed. And that's really no surprise, but the research certainly supports it. The latest research from our lab, my lab at Westchester University, we just published on this in October of 2020, certainly corroborates this, and we dove a little bit more into this. In other words, if we take a step back to the last slide, okay, greater forces and greater top speeds require a faster rate of vertical force application when the foot strikes the ground. How's what's going on up the kinetic chain at the thigh? How is that setting that up? So we looked at 40 athletes, 20 males, 20 females, track and field, including sprinters, hurdlers, and jumpers. We had team sport athletes. We had recreationally trained athletes. So this was a very eclectic, heterogeneous group. And what we did is we looked at runners across their top speeds. And for purposes of comparison, I'm going to look at a faster athlete versus a slower athlete. Faster was 10 meters a second. Slower was a really slow athlete, just kind of a club lacrosse athlete. And we can see they're doing drastically different things with their running mechanics. And this is for the purposes of illustration. By the way, we are in an indoor gymnasium on kind of a multi-purpose floor. This athlete was running it at 10 meters a second here, although it's the same athlete from the earlier video. He could hit about 10.5 in spikes on a Mondo track. So we looked at the thigh angular motion. The thighs basically flex and extend in this harmonic sinusoidal pattern. So they kind of work like scissors is the easiest way to think about it. On this graph I'm about to show, we can look at the right thighs in purple, the left thighs in yellow or gold. And on the graph that shows up, we have time in seconds on the x-axis, and we have thigh angle, flexion towards the top and extension towards the bottom on this graph. And we're just going to watch this video play through. And what's really interesting is we can see that the thighs kind of work in direct synchronous motion. So they're like scissors, and as one thigh flexes, the other thigh extends and vice versa. And what we're going to take a look at on these next couple of graphs is the range of motion that these thighs work through and the frequency. So the amplitude and the frequency is key as far as not just top speed, but how it sets up the forces that are applied. So although this has always kind of been intuitively known, I think by both researchers and practitioners alike, this study, this research really dove into this and looked at it with a magnifying glass, if you will. If we compare our faster sprinter on the right to our slower kind of club lacrosse athlete on the left, just for the purposes of contrast here, we can see that the sprinter on the right had a faster thigh oscillation. The limbs are just working back and forth at a faster rate. We can see that because he completes his stride cycle in kind of a compressed period of time, almost like taking an accordion and squishing that accordion in on the right-hand graph. Versus on the left-hand graph, it takes that slower athlete a longer period to cycle the limbs through. If you want to think of this as turnover, you can. This is basically just how fast are the limbs turning over, cycling through their range of motion. One thing that hadn't been looked at a lot before in the research we noted was the actual range of motion that the thighs are working to. So we found in our data set here, and I've also found this in some other elite sprinters that I work with, that for maximal speed, the optimal range of motion that the thighs need to work through, I'm going to say this loud and clear because it's not actually on the slide, but for emphasis, from peak extension behind the body to peak flexion in front of the body, the thighs need to work through about 100 degrees range of motion. So typically about 20 to 30 degrees behind the body, and then somewhere about 70 to 80 degrees in front of the body seems to be optimal. So about 100 degrees range of motion with that distribution, about 20 to 25 and back, and maybe 75 in front. So the amplitude was bigger in our faster athletes. It's also shifted front side. In other words, the thigh swing was less behind the body, and that was represented over here by the thigh amplitude being kind of lower on the graph, whereas the amplitude, the range of motion is occurring more in front of the body as emphasized over here. And basically, the faster runners were having a faster thigh angular velocity throughout the entire gait cycle, and that was setting up their ability to strike the ground. So we found this huge correlation between the thigh angular velocity throughout the entire gait cycle and running speed, not just across all speeds, but if you looked at top speed, this was just highly correlated to top speed, was how big was the range of motion and how fast were the athletes going through that range of motion. So we have on the x-axis top speed, and on the y-axis, we have two y-axes, but if you look over here on the right-hand y-axis, we have thigh angular velocity in degrees per second. And the data tells a pretty clear story. The faster the runners can move their limbs, the thighs through that range of motion, the faster the speed. Although we had a heterogeneous data set, we did have some real stars in this, especially on the women's side. We had women's gold medalists from the Olympics in this data set who weren't pictured in those videos. So this isn't a new concept necessarily. From a research standpoint, though, I think it's something that's kind of been forgotten, if you will. So Tom Tellez, I'm going to play a video where he talks about this. I know in the webinar you might not be able to hear this video, but I think in the slides that I sent you, he goes through this entire talk on thigh angular velocity, thigh angular acceleration, and basically the stretch shortening cycle. What's going on with the hip flexors as they get stretched after toe off, and how that stretch shortening cycle helps the thigh swing through on the forward recovery with a greater angular velocity. And if you couldn't hear it in that video and you can't play it back with the PowerPoint you have, no problem. This book that just came out clearly details it. And again, this nicely ties in the force enhancing mechanisms at the hip also increase the angular velocity of the leg as it swings through. I mean, what's old is new again. I don't know how to say it. This is just classic stuff from Tellez that's been out there for a long time, since the 90s. But I think we've kind of gotten away from this in evaluating this metric in our top speed mechanics and saying, hey, this is important, not just for frequency, not just for turnover, but it also directly ties into how much force the athlete can apply. And again, I just kind of bolded this up here, right? So as the hip extends, initiating a stretch of the hip flexor muscle tendon system, okay? This stretch initiates the stretch reflex mechanism. Together, they increase the angular velocity of the leg. So it'll help it rapidly swing forward in preparation for the next landing phase, okay? Couldn't say it better myself. Our data from our research last year directly corroborates this. And again, I think this is something that's been out there for a while that now we need to refocus on a little bit, because it just kind of connects all the dots. Ralph Mann has known this all along from his research in the 90s and in his book, The Mechanics of Sprinting and Hurdling. He just clearly says this in bold-faced terms. Of all the specific performance variables, upper leg, i.e. thigh, rotational speed is the most critical in the production of an elite sprinter sprint performance. So upper leg or thigh angular velocity is key. In my mind, when you have Tom Tellez and Ralph Mann, and by the way, Franz Bosch hits on all of these concepts as well. When those people are saying all starting to converge on the same thing, and then our research kind of backs that up, to me, I'm sold. I'm convinced. So this is something I think that, you know, has been known for 30 years, but we need to refocus on a little bit. I'm going to tie that into some research from the SMU lab that I was lucky enough to be a part of. So we're going to come back to this graphic here. Again, we know that competitive sprinters or faster runners, generally speaking, are applying more force in the first contact, in the first part of the contact phase than their slower counterparts. If you want to think of this not as competitive sprinters versus athletic non-sprinters, just say, hey, this is my elite jumper who can run at 11 meters a second versus my non-elite jumper who can only hit 10 meters a second. What's the difference? It's going to be similar, okay? So we came up with what was called the two-mass model, and I'm not going to dive too much into this. There's the papers there if you're interested in reading as a follow-up. But essentially, we looked at how force gets applied. What causes this? The graph that's on your screen right now with the greater rate of force application in the sprinters, what causes this? And what we basically used as a model, and again, all models are good, but not all models are perfect, or whatever the saying goes. What we used as a model to understand this is the two-mass model, essentially looking at the lower limb, foot, shank, as one mass one, and the rest of the body we just grouped as this other mass two, for kind of representative purposes. And what we found was that these total force waveforms in our faster runners and our faster sprinters had this shape, this upside down U shape. And it was because the faster runners were getting a big impact contribution from the lower limb. They were winding up and striking the ground, really punching the ground in a way that caused this fast rising edge to the force waveform and allowed them to have a higher rate of force application during the first part of ground contact. So where are they getting their force? Well, the faster lower limb velocity at touchdown combined with a stiffer impact at ground contact resulted in these greater vertical forces. I'll say that again for emphasis. The lower limb impact, that mass one, that red curve, causes the sharp rising edge of the vertical force waveform. And what sets that up is the faster limb velocities at touchdown combined with a stiff ground contact. Here's just a little video. Again, we can look at the same runner and we can look at the total vertical force waveform in blue, and that's made up of the two sub impulses. The impulse from mass one, which represents the lower limb striking the ground. That's the red impulse there, the red curve. And then the green curve, which is a little hard to see, is just the rest of the body, the catch and the rebound of the rest of the body. So let's take a step back and let's tie it all together. What are the critical variables for rate of force application? Well, we need fast angular velocity throughout the entire gait cycle. That leads to a fast backswing velocity leading up to touchdown. That leads to a fast lower limb velocity, foot and lower limb velocity at touchdown. That's both down and back towards the track. The athlete really needs to attack the track and combine with a stiff lower limb deceleration after touchdown. That's going to lead to high forces and high rate of vertical force application. So both big forces and high rate, and that's going to lead to fast sprinting speed. So tie it all together: fast thigh angular velocity, fast foot touchdown velocities, stiff ground contact. That's going to result in a high rate of vertical force application and fast top speeds. This to me is a really good summary slide. So if it hasn't kind of honed in, if you've had a hard time honing in on all of it or connecting the dots, to me, this slide always helps to connect the dots, basically. What are we looking for? Well, ultimately fast top speeds. This requires all four of these contributing factors. Now, we have just a way I've thought of thinking about it, or two slides on ways that I could conceptualize it. I'm not sure that I would cue your athletes in this way. When I work with my athletes, I wouldn't necessarily say, hey, I want you to bounce, scissor, and strike, but just a way you can think about it. So the runner should appear to bounce. They need enough lift in between each step to attack the ground on the next step. Air time is going to be roughly 0.12 or 0.125 seconds plus a little bit. So they need to be bouncing with each step. The thigh should aggressively scissor. It's a Franz Bosch term, I think, originally, although I'm sure others have said it. I really like that term. We looked at the thigh angular motion video. As one leg flexes, the other extends. That needs to be as violent as possible. It's not good enough to hit big splits, like where one thigh is fully flexed in front of the body. It's not good enough to hit these big positions. The runners need to hit those positions and reverse it. Rapid thigh reversal at peak flexion and extension. By the way, that same concept holds true in acceleration mechanics. And then once that front leg hits that peak flexion, the runner needs to forcefully strike the ground, attack the ground, and remain stiff to maximize the rate of force development. So we can also just think of it like this. We need to have the hips have this kind of elastic mechanism, this torsional stiffness, that kind of stretch shortening cycle we talked about during the flight phase, where the limbs hit peak flexion and extension and rapidly reverse. And then upon ground contact, we need to see real stiffness and not a lot of collapse upon ground contact. So what does this look like as far as evaluating technique? And I'm going to go through some slides just where we look at what this should look like. What are we looking for as coaches when we're evaluating technique in our speed power athletes? And this is the fastest athlete I was ever lucky enough to work with, both in the lab on that treadmill and on the track. Obviously with USA Track and Field, I've gotten to work with just some amazing athletes and been on the track when, Noah Lyles is testing and that sort of thing. But this athlete here, I was lucky enough to have in the lab at SMU and then go out to the track for some testing both and really see the mechanics and the forces in both scenarios and pretty incredible. He's a little past his prime now, but we can see just kind of what this looks like on the track. In competition, is it going to look like this, either for a sprinter or jumper? Maybe not quite, but a good way to think about what it should look like in practice. Now let's transfer over to a treadmill scenario. And we have a team sport athlete on the right for the purposes of contrast. Clearly, none of you guys coach team sport athletes, but for transparency, this athlete on the right has the worst mechanics ever. So it's kind of a good compare and contrast with the athlete on the right versus the competitive sprinter on the left. So what are we looking for? Well, I think it's good to take a top-down approach when looking at max velocity mechanics. And again, we're going to see the athlete on the left do a lot of things correctly, and the athlete on the right do almost everything incorrectly. So from a posture standpoint, I think the posture sets the tone. If the posture isn't correct, it's going to be really challenging for anything else to be correct. So we see the athlete on the left, the posture is very upright and neutral. We see the athlete on the right, the chest is leaning forward. There's some excessive rotation going on, some pelvic collapse. We'll talk about the pelvis a lot moving forward. If we go down the chain, the athlete on the left has less backside swing. In other words, if we draw a plumb line down from the ear to the shoulder to the hips, that thigh doesn't swing too far back behind the body, only a little bit. Again, maybe 20 degrees maximum. The athlete on the on the right, and again, that athlete is up there for comparative purposes, has a ton of backside swing behind the body. The thigh is just way back behind the body. How far the thigh swings behind the body is going to limit how far in front of the body it can get. So if the thigh goes not that far behind the body, if there's limited backside mechanics, it's going to allow the athlete to get the thigh up in front of the body. That's a good thing, as we all know. Okay, the athlete on the right, too much backside swing, can't get the thigh up in front of the body. By the way, the posture and the pelvis entirely set this tone. If the posture is upright and the pelvis is neutral, it's going to allow the thighs to move where they should. If the posture is out of position, and especially if the pelvis is anteriorly tilted, then there really is not much chance to have the limbs swing in the proper place. To use a Bosch term again, I think, if the athlete on the left has good posture, good thigh mechanics, that allows that athlete to attack the ground from above, the athlete on the right-hand side, the posture's off, the pelvic position's off, the thigh mechanics aren't in the right spot. That's going to basically force that athlete to cast out with a passive landing. That's not only bad for performance, but that's going to put the athlete in a position for soft tissue injury, hamstring, groin, hip flexor. And then lastly, we need a stiff ground contact. So we're really trying to strike without excessive mush, for lack of a more scientific term. So let's just take a look at this kind of step by step. So torso relatively upright. Again, we want the hips neutral and avoiding anterior pelvic tilt. A lot of athletes who struggle with this, you just need to get them off of the track and get them going through a little bit of tilting motion, have them stick their butt out behind them, get into excessive anterior tilt, and then just have them stand tall to really feel what it feels like to shift the pelvis more neutral, almost to a posterior type of tilt. Okay. From there, again, we want to minimize the thigh swing behind the body. So if we draw that plumb line down from the torso, we shouldn't see that the thigh's going too far behind the body. By the way, we should see that the foot is relatively neutral. If we have excessive plantar flexion, that's going to kind of limit our triple flexor pattern. So we should have upright posture, good pelvis. Thigh shouldn't swing too far behind the body. Foot should basically return to neutral after toe off, or as best as possible. We need a powerful recovery. Again, we saw with Tellez talking about the stretch shortening cycle and the stretch reflex. Okay, we talked about the thigh angular motion. It should be roughly 100 degrees if it's done correctly, from peak extension behind the body to peak flexion. The athlete on the left here is a little bit too compact, actually, but it should be about 100 degrees, and more of that motion should be shifted in front of the body, okay? So that if we see these two kind of triangles, if you will, clearly the athlete on the left, that triangle is shifted towards the front. That gives us the high knee lift, which is classically associated with good force application. Aim to strike under the hips. The ball of the foot should be the aiming point with the ankle neutral. The contact shin should be near vertical. And I would never use this to cue my athletes during the course of a run or on the track. But if we're watching video, the easiest way to assess whether or not they're executing frontside mechanics is how much daylight is there between the knees at ground contact. So if I can see a lot of daylight between the knees, like in the team sport athlete on the right, that's a problem. That means that the athlete hasn't executed the mechanics correctly. Basically, the knee should be in line at the point of initial ground contact, as demonstrated by the sprinter on the left. And then we look at ground contact mechanics from a stiffness standpoint. We should see that the runner is basically stiff from the ground up through the torso. If I'm looking at the athlete in the sagittal plane from the side view, there shouldn't be excessive collapse at the ankle and knee. Is there going to be some flexion at the ankle, knee, and hip? Yeah, some. There's going to be a little bit. Have to have that kind of stretch reflex take over, but not excessive. We don't want to see the athlete collapsing into the ground. Likewise, if you're taking video from the front or from the back, we don't want to see excessive frontal plane pelvic collapse in particular. So if we see the pelvis is rocking and rolling all over upon ground contact, that probably means that the athlete doesn't have the unilateral stability to keep the pelvis stabilized, level during ground contact. That's going to prolong our ground contact phase, and anything that prolongs our ground contact phase slows us down. What about arm mechanics? You notice I haven't talked a ton about them yet, but as far as what we're looking for, what we want, and my video seems to be slowing down a little bit here, we want to see arm mechanics that basically mirror the leg motion. So if we want the legs that are going through big ranges of motion, big amplitude, really powerfully at the thighs, we want the shoulders to mimic that. So we should get powerful arm drive that originates from the shoulder, shouldn't be beating the bongo drum. The elbow can be opening and closing a little bit, certainly. Okay, that's not going to stay rigid at 90 degrees, as is sometimes said. That elbow joint's going to be open and closing naturally. That's fine. The shoulder should be the driver of the movement. We're going to get a similar stretch reflex at the shoulder that we get at the hip. We want that to happen. So aggressively driving the shoulders in a way that mirrors the thighs. This should all be synchronized. for maximal coordination between upper and lower bodies. So should jumpers look like sprinters at top speed? I mean, I'll let you guys decide, but the pictures prove it to me. I mean, yeah, or, I think the mechanics generally need to look similar. That's my take on the situation. Obviously, the guy on the left there is one of the best all time to do both. We see a lot of carryover. You got to have a great top speed to be a great jumper. The mechanics can't deviate too much from what we're looking for in sprinters to what we're looking for in our jumpers if we want to see it done right and we want to see the big forces, the fast top speeds on the approach. So next, I'm just going to get a little bit into the drills and exercises. I know it's 10:05 my time, or 5 after the hour your time. So I'll go through a little bit quickly here just to make sure we have time for questions and answers at the end. You guys are all great coaches and great athletes. I don't expect any of this to be new to you. I certainly expect all of this to be stuff you've seen before or perhaps currently do. But I'll just kind of add my take on things. Again, I'm a researcher and a teacher first, but I am also a coach for our track athletes. This was actually one of our conference champion jumpers who was doing these drill demos for me. He was a long and triple jumper for us. Just kind of my take on how we can include some of these concepts in our practices and how to best apply some of the scientific aspects that we just talked about. I always like sneaking in max velocity mechanics in our warm-ups. So everything we do from a dynamic warm-up standpoint, we start and finish in a sprinter pose and just kind of this triple flexion position. The athlete's upright. We call it 3 bucket of water resting on the head, bucket of water on a knee, bucket handle hanging off the foot. It not only enforces this position, provides context, it's great for developing balance and stability. And by the way, for those of you who do any sort of lunge or one leg RDL in your warm-up series or in your weight room, this forces the athlete to apply force, pun intended. It constrains them to push tall to the top position. You can't do a lazy lunge if you're finishing in a sprinter pose. So I think it's a great way to start and finish any one leg RDL or any one leg movement, basically. Just as far as, kind of how we incorporate this into our warm-up, and actually I would have preferred this athlete did this a little bit more violently, but I love the thigh switches, either in place, in place forward, triples. Again, anything that emphasizes a rapid thigh reversal through big ranges of motion and a stiff ground contact. Rapid thigh reversal through a big range of motion and a stiff ground contact. To me, that's a winner. You got to warm your athletes up anyways. Might as well be doing drills that enforce what you're looking for from a top speed standpoint. The A series, which is coming up next. Again, I know these are drills that we all do, right? This is certainly not rocket science, and it's nothing new. My videos seem to be a little bit choppy here. That's okay. It's all about the intent, I should say, from my standpoint. Why are we doing these? What are we looking for? Posture, again, using these is a great teaching tool for upright posture and hip position. Stiff ground contact. Where should we be striking the ground? Again, ball of the foot, really popping on and off the ground. When these are done right, I think you can hear the athlete do it correctly, even if they're done on a turf field. You should hear the athlete pop on and off the ground. So the intent is on posture, ground contact, force application. Again, the step overs or the dribbles, something we all do, I'm sure, but what's the emphasis? Why are we doing these? Well, again, the posture, stability, and stiffness. We should be popping on and off the ground at all times. For my athletes that land too plantar flexed when they're running at top speed, and they have a tendency from their athletic background before they get to our university, or just that's just the way they run. If they are naturally too plantar flexed, these drills are great for teaching proper foot position at ground contact during top speed sprinting, getting into a feel of how to contact the ground when not sprinting at top speed provides context for what to do at top speed. Love these, a straight leg shuffle, run, and bound. Again, great for emphasizing front side mechanics here. To me, this is a drill that, of course, needs to be coached, but once it's coached and the athlete knows what they're doing, this idiot proofs backside mechanics. it's impossible to do this drill and have backside mechanics. The thigh, quite frankly, just can't swing behind the body, or else the athlete will fall face down, fall forward face down, right? So striking underneath the center of mass, striking on the balls of the feet, big ranges of motion, and especially when you do the bound version of this, as we're watching right now, applying force to project the body forward. Bounding, again, I love. Why are we doing it? I'm sure as jumpers, you guys are all doing this. I love the submaximal and maximal versions of this. To me, this teaches position of the limbs, again, reinforcing the front side mechanics, and then force application just as far as teaching the athlete to push through the ground. So this entire series of drills we include with our speed and power athletes, almost every high neural day. And I think these are easy things you can do to provide context for the top speed mechanics that you're looking for. Now, with that being said, drills and drills alone can't improve top speed. We need to actually run fast, so to speak. As far as changing top speed mechanics, what can we do to affect a change in our runners' mechanics? I love what are termed, or what I would term, technical flies. So 20 meter or 20-yard buildup, 20-meter fly, 20-meter decel. You can kick that out a little bit longer. The point of these is that you're running fast, but it's not all out, and the athlete is focusing on something. The athlete's running all out at 100%. We all know you can't focus on something and effectively run at 100%. Either your speed's going to suffer, or you're just not going to be able to really execute the change in mechanics you're looking for. I've found just through experience that athletes can dial it back just a touch. You say they're 95% or just a hair back from top speed, and give one technical focus per rep, that affecting change can happen. And gradually over time, perhaps you can get them to improve the aspect of mechanics that you're working on. We do this in big group settings as well, but I'm sure most of you guys are working in smaller groups. So wickets, I wanted to briefly touch upon this. I like wickets. I know not all coaches do. I feel like some great coaches use wickets, some great coaches don't. I've found from our experience with our athletes that we can hit really fast speeds while running through wickets with good mechanics. And these are not just our sprinters. These are all of our speed and power athletes we have do wickets. To me, it's not just to set them up and let the athletes go and, the wickets correct mechanics. These need to be highly coached. As far as what you're asking the athlete to do, and takes practice. We found with 4 to 5 weeks of practice, our athletes can nearly match their free sprint top speeds. So we did actually a little research study. We're kind of preparing a manuscript now, where we had the athletes do free sprint. We measured their top speed with timing gates. We measured their stride length and stride rate with video. After 4 to 5 weeks of practicing in wickets, we measured their top speed with the wickets set at their natural stride length. They could basically match their top speed while in wickets. I mean, within just a few tenths of a meter per second, if not matching it for some athletes. To me, what that demonstrates is, hey, wickets promote good posture, good front side mechanics, good ground contacts. And if you do them right, you can do them in a way that's very, very fast. So I'm an advocate of wickets for those reasons, with the caveat that they need to be coached, and the stride, you need to do them targeted. Can't just throw the wickets out there at any distance and expect it to work out. I think the wickets need to be set at distances that, are very targeted to what your athletes actually do in their free sprint. And then lastly, I would just say, to sprint fast, you need to sprint fast. We do just a ton of fly 10s and fly 20s, and 20 to 30 meter buildup with gates, with iPad. I don't think it needs to be rocket science. Clearly, with USA Track and Field, we do a much more comprehensive data collection and analysis. This is just what we do at practice on a weekly basis. And we just, we know what their fastest free sprints are from our pre-testing. And we just do a set number of reps until they drop off below a certain percentage of top speed. Usually we put that at around 96% of top speed, and We'll do 3, 4, 5 reps. And once they start to fall below that, they're done for the day. That is clearly just a general recommendation. You guys will be doing some, much more advanced or specific programming, I know, but that's just kind of some very general recommendations for what we do. Other general recommendations, I always view that technique drills are warm-up drills and vice versa. So everything we do at the latter portion of our warm-up should have some component of top speed technique involved in it. It should provide a context, be working on a certain aspect of posture, foot ground contact, force application, etc. We do either the technical flies or the wicket runs before we have them do free sprints. On our max velocity days, we'll typically time them, our athletes, once a week or once every other week. We always want to know where their top speed is. Doesn't have to be very high volume, relatively low volume, high recovery, but we just want to know kind of where they're at throughout the course of the off season or leading into competition. Last thing I want to kind of talk about, which is on a slightly different track, which is just vertical stiffness during ground contact and potentially some metrics that we could start gathering. Darren and I had spoken about this in our preparations for the Zoom. So as far as the scientific aspect of top speed mechanics, we talked about stiffness. Okay, you need to have the good posture, the good hip position, fast thigh angular velocities, fast limb velocity at touchdown, strike stiff. What does that mean? Well, stiffness in its simplest sense is how much force divided by how much displacement. So if you have a really stiff ground contact, you apply lots of force and you don't collapse much. That slinky, that spring, is going to be able to tolerate a lot of force without much displacement. For sprinters at top speed, and actually this is data from one of our 2014 papers, the data on the right that never actually got published, but it's kind of cool stuff. The peak force occurs, about 30% of the way into the ground contact phase. So on that left-hand panel, we have ground contact time as a percentage of ground contact. We can see that the peak force in units of body weights peaks out about 30% of the way in. The center of mass hits its lowest point at about 40% of the ground contact phase. And if you look at any of the IAAF reports on the 100-meter dash, they show similar data here. That displacement is not much, 0.02 meters. So, a centimeter, an inch for us in America here, right? So it's not displacing much if you strike stiff. So for typical terms during sprinting, 3,200 newtons of peak force, 0.025 meters of peak displacement, we get a stiffness. And don't worry about the units. It's kilonewtons per meter. That's really not important. That's your stiffness value, about 130. Let's keep that in mind. There's no plyometrics that match the short contact times of sprinting. We talked about that way at the beginning of the presentation. But are there plyometrics that match the stiffness values of sprinting? Are there plyos or drills with similar peak forces and similar stiffnesses, vertical stiffness to sprinting? This is just pilot data. I don't want anyone to, read too much into this and say, well, Ken presented this data and this is from a research study, et cetera. It's not. This is just one athlete, one example in our lab. This is the same athlete you've seen throughout, okay, competitive 100-meter sprinter, just doing the easiest plyometric there is, a one-leg pogo hop. Maybe it doesn't seem like much, but we measured this. This is on a force plate in our lab. The force plates are covered up with rubber matting, so you can't quite see them. But we used motion capture and force plate data to determine the peak force and the peak displacement. The peak forces were way higher than we thought, about 3,500 newtons to nearly 4,000 newtons or above. The displacement was not much, about the same as when you sprint. So can you get ground contact times that mimic sprinting? No, with plyometrics. But can you get stiffnesses that are very similar to sprinting in very simple plyometrics? Yes, I think this pilot data would venture to say yes. I've had other people test this out with just very simple plyometric drills. So I think these simple but effective plyometrics can mimic the stiffnesses needed for very, very fast speed sprinting. And with that, this is something that Darren and I talked about. What are some other metrics that maybe we need to gather with, the UK Athletics jumpers. There's been various jump studies and reactive strength index, which is the ratio of jump height or flight time to contact time. There's a bunch of different reactive strength index tests that are out there. To me, some of the coolest research is, again, come on from Ryu Nagahara's group in Japan. And they found that in the late acceleration phase, and if you look at the little part I have highlighted on the left-hand side, from approximately 23 to 34 meters from the start line, so you guys can think about where that would potentially be, with your approach, deep into acceleration is what I'm getting at. As the athlete approaches top speed, this ankle rebound continuous jump, so this in the lower right hand of this graphic, these repeated jump tests where the athlete is basically keeping the legs pretty straight and using just the ankles to generate the power, was highly correlated with sprint speed deep into the acceleration as the athlete approached top speed. So, I think this is an area worth exploring for this group as a whole. Are there some simple monitoring tools that we can do and generate some metrics on these reactive strength index type of tests to create a database and monitor going forward, and perhaps in particular these type of continuous rebound ankle type of hops, because we know that they're going to be correlated with speed and also that they may have stiffness levels that approach what we see in top speed sprinting. So just to wrap it up, I know I'm going a little bit over. Want to make sure we leave time for question and answer, and I'm happy to stick around late. So science of top speed. Well, hey, all four of these characteristics are hugely important. Fast rotational velocities of the limbs, stiff ground contact that's going to allow for short ground contact times, high rate of force application. All of that is what allows for fast top speeds. We're looking at, mechanics. We want to see from the top down, upper left hand, I'll start with there. Good posture, good pelvis or hip position. That's going to allow for proper limitation of backside swing mechanics, 20 to 30 degrees behind the body. That's going to, again, allow for a proper front side recovery combined with kind of that stretch reflex in the hip, and then attacking the ground with the correct touchdown position, attacking from above into a stiff ground contact. And then from a training standpoint, I like to integrate the sprint drills into the warm-up, always trying to provide a context for what we're looking for with our top speed mechanics. I love the bounding variations, which I'm sure as jumps coaches, you guys are already doing. To me, those also transfer very nicely to top speed development. I'm partial to the technical flies and wickets when we're trying to affect change in mechanics, but still have our athletes run at a fast speed. And then lastly, of course, you got to run fast to run fast. If we're truly trying to improve our athletes' top speed, I think at least, some dosage of top speed of maximal sprinting is going to be necessary to really get a bump up in that ceiling. So with that, I'm sure Darren can distribute my contact information to the group. If you guys have follow-up questions that we don't get to now, feel free to follow me on social media or on my website is kenclarkspeed.com. But I just wanted to, again, before we dive into question and answer, to say thank you guys for your time and attention. I know that's a lot of content, a lot of information. Appreciate you guys taking the time and the energy to listen. And I guess at this point, I'll turn it back to Darren and then for some question and answer. So.
And thank you very much for that. That was excellent, mate. As we've discussed, I've met you before, and we've kind of gone through your presentation. And there's always something new coming out of the presentations on that. I'll give the coaches and athletes kind of just a few minutes just to reflect and come up with some questions, hopefully. But from my point of view, there's a few things that's kind of really resonated with me on that presentation, Ken, is kind of the importance of the postures and positions. Particularly around the hips and the shoulders and how that sets everything up. So I really like that top-down approach that you talked about in the presentation and in the summary there, and ensuring that, certainly from the hips point of view, to get that angular velocity and that extension reflex with the switch of the scissors is really important on that. The summary slide that you had around the mechanical determinants, absolutely spot on. Looking at the angular velocity of the thigh, the fast foot touchdown velocity, the stiff ground contact stuff. And it's really interesting. You just talked about some of the kind of research around that single leg, that stiffness, and then obviously the rate of vertical force. So the summary of those kind of mechanical deterministic stuff really kind of sits well in terms of what we're looking to do in terms of setting up top speed stuff. So so some really loads of stuff to digest.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the feedback, Darren. And yeah, I mean, from a technical standpoint, as far as what you're looking for with the coach's eye, again, that's just my perspective. I don't claim to be the best coach out there for sure, but the top-down approach to me is really an effective way of looking at it, because as I said, Darren, and as you just we're kicking back, if the posture in the pelvis is off, is misaligned, to me it's very challenging for anything else to go right, so to speak, with top speed. If the athlete, in their approach is not able to transition from the acceleration into transitional acceleration, if they can't fully push themselves tall and push themselves into a good position, chest and hips, then, I think, can you run fast? Yeah. But are you running as fast as you could be? I don't think so. So to me, I think that's definitely the easiest way to do the checklist of mechanics from the top down. So.
Cool. Well, listen, I'll open it up to the floor. If anybody wants to pose a question, feel free to kind of raise your hand and we'll bring you in. Or you can use the chat function in the box as well if anyone would rather just type up a question. So I'm going to open it up. Anyone, if nobody volunteers, I will be picking people out from the audience.
I'll ask a question. John, I'll ask, you mentioned an integrated training program. As the guys in England will know, I favour an undulating approach, periodization. Is that the type of model that you would follow? So you're training speed all year round, building up specific speed from the get-go, or do you spend a period of time base building?
I guess with great question, John. I'm not sure I have an answer to that per se as it relates to the periodization. I guess I would leave that up to what you see best. I think I was more I guess just commenting on the fact of having multiple approaches for hamstring health is where that research is starting to trend. That it's not just and some of this may be common sense, but it's not just doing Nordics. It's not just doing RDLs or stiff-legged deadlifts or deadlifts. And it's not just saying, hey, sprinting is going to be the only activity we do to challenge the hamstrings. So I guess I was less so commenting on the periodization of it, linear undulating, whatever the case may be. I'll leave that up to you guys as your athletes, your annual cycle. More so just saying that the research is trending to show that an integrated approach, a multifaceted approach that includes a number of different ways to target the hamstrings is perhaps a good way to go from a reducing risk of hamstring injury standpoint. How you cycle that through your periodization model, I trust that you guys know what's best for your athletes, et cetera. But definitely that multiple ways of attacking and bulletproofing the hamstrings, I think is worth having in at any one time in the annual cycle.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I hope I didn't sidestep your question,
No.
but that's as answering it as best I can.
No, that's fair enough. No, I remember you did talk in the context of hamstrings, so yeah, fine. I'll shut up and let somebody else ask the question.
Aston, on you go, buddy.
Okay.
I
think I've got a number of questions, but I'm going to start with this one. I'd be interested in your view on the ability to sort of change or to improve frequency. And I think you probably, I don't know whether or not that to you is about the rate of thigh exchange or the Caesar effect or whatever it is, opposed to stride length. Yeah. Which one of those variables after a certain time, after a certain age, after a certain amount of training, conditioning, which one of those variables is easier to move or to improve upon?
Yeah, great question. From a research standpoint, I don't think the answer is conclusively out there, because I do think that there's just room for there's just a lot of individual variation in that. I think, just very anecdotally here, that for the athletes that you guys see, they may be nearing their upper range of frequency, right? I mean, I think there's just a certain genetic component to that. And when they get to you, I'm not saying a developmental high school or, mid-level university athlete, but the athletes you guys are seeing, they may be reaching the upper limit of where they're at from a frequency standpoint. I think, again, just observationally from my experience, if you can affect a change in their mechanics that allows them to apply force better. So that includes the bigger range of motion. Maybe if it's harder to affect the frequency of the scissoring, but a bigger range of motion, and you get them from a 90 to 95 degree range of motion to a 100 degree range of motion, and you shift that a little more front side, just a little bit more, and now they're in a better position to apply force. And now just a little bit more force, as we talked, 1/10 of a body weight goes a long way. That's probably where you're going to get the most bang for your buck from an overall speed enhancement standpoint. Again, there's no research that's looked at that. That's a very hard research study to do, basically, in elite athletes. But just from my work with USA Track and Field, and just kind of observationally, with these concepts in mind over the last couple of years, I think that would be the goal, is affecting a change, getting a little bit bigger amplitude, getting that amplitude to occur a little more front side for better force application, knowing that will probably affect more of a change in stride length from the enhanced force. If you get an athlete that's coming to you with a step rate of 4.7 steps per second, that you might be hard pressed to get a big increase in frequency there. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does. I mean, your thinking is in line with mine, and it's just interesting to actually get a view from the expert, because again, for me, right, it's all anecdotal necessarily.
Right.
There's nothing out there that actually
no matter how you get the improvement in speed, I mean, whether it comes from an increase in stride rate or stride length doesn't really matter, provided you get the end result. I think, the one other thing you could do, though, from an individualization standpoint, is I think this is why it's important to do the simple testing of our athletes, during their top speed sprinting. And, that can just be with the timing gates and an iPad, frankly. I mean, you can get a lot of information from that, just as far as top speed, stride rate, stride length, contact time, and flight time. Your contact times are going to be accurate within 0.04 seconds, right? So if you see, and where I'm going with that, Aston, is if you see a jumper who, has a suboptimal top speed, let's say it's a male, long jumper with a top speed of 10 meters per second, we know that needs to be 10.5, and you can identify that athlete's running 10 meters a second with a stride rate that's only 4.3 steps per second. Well, maybe in that case, that athlete would get more bang for the buck over, doing something a little bit more frequency based. Yeah. But generally speaking, to your question, I'd say in this elite type of population, you're more likely to gonna get a bump from the stride length.
Thanks for
that. Yeah, but worth doing that. And Darren, I think we spoke about this, but I kind of forget. I'm not sure what is being done just on a regular basis as far as those sprinting metrics, with these athletes or in these groups. I'm a huge advocate. I make the same push in USA Track and Field that, the groups just need to be doing regular monitoring, even if that monitoring is just fly times with, timing gates and simple video-based analysis just to get these metrics. So I think that can help identify weakness in individual athletes as well. So I'm not sure what's done on a regular, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a plan over the winter to do the testing over kind of physical camps, but
right.
we're stuck online. So
yeah.
But, yeah.
In a normal year, I guess, right? Like everything else COVID related. It's like, well, what would we be doing in a normal year? So.
Yeah, COVID's got a lot to answer for.
Right.
Cool. Anyone else? I know, Aston, you said you've got a few, so happy if you want to crack on, unless anyone else has got a burning one.
Okay, I mean, am I? Yeah, you can still hear me, right? I mean, I have one direct one. I think my other comment probably would be almost thanking Ken for saying what he said about posture and about the running mechanics, because all of that actually feeds into what we've been trying to do and sort of relay to athletes and coaches over a number of seminars is the way you run is the way you jump and the way you take off. Yeah, and what you've done is actually set up exactly what the approach and the posture and the positions of the limbs and stuff like that needs to be for the jumper to effect a proper takeoff into their jumping, as it were. So that just, for me, right, that just re-emphasizes and double down on a number of things that we've been trying to get across. So thanks for that. So that's
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Aston. You know, and that's certainly, it's the same way with our athletes, even though, you know, the athletes that I coach are not at the elite level outside of USATF. The athletes I coach at the university level, you know, we try to present a unifying strategy, just similar strategies. So it's not, hey, you do one thing for acceleration and another thing for top speed and another thing when you're doing your jumps. The simpler and the more unified we can make it for the athletes, the better. And, you know, although we didn't go much into acceleration today, you know, an interesting side note is, although clearly there's differences between acceleration and top speed from a biomechanical standpoint, how the body's leaning, the contact times, et cetera, I always make the point that many more things are similar between acceleration and top speed than people realize. I mean, have a good, strong, neutral posture, apply a lot of force, try to keep the recovery pretty front side, and then just gradually transition upright. Again, trying to present themes that are more unified from acceleration to top speed. And then, you know, as you just commented, Aston, even into the, you know, in the approach and in the actual jump itself. So yeah, glad that the message was aligned with everything else that you guys teach. I think that's the way it should be.
For sure. Thanks. And my question would I suppose, just to clarify, when you talk about speed bounds or sprint bounds, do you do that flat-footed, or do you ask the athlete to apply maybe ball of foot? Which way?
Yeah,
or either?
Good question. And I didn't comment specifically on that, and I probably should have. No, with those we will do kind of roll through the ground contact. Yeah, so not necessarily a front of foot or ball of foot. With our jumpers in particular, though, yeah, that'll be more flat-footed, rolling through ground contact with the emphasis on force application. And yeah, I love the bounds. I think they, you know, for any number of reasons we talked about, applying force, getting the limb segment coordination to get the proper block at the top. And I think there's, you know, just so many different variations of those that are effective. So,
okay. Would you do anything on the ball of foot at all? Any bounding at all?
I think that the straight-legged bounds are done on ball of the foot. Yeah. So
Okay.
Wouldn't want flat-footed contact there. I think my athlete who's demonstrating those was perhaps a tiny bit flat-footed, but when I cue those, it's, you know, front part of the foot underneath the hip, with all of the action, you know, coming from the hip. Not to go too much into specifics with each drill, but, you know, common errors I see with the straight-legged bound is posture. So why it's great is because it eliminates backside mechanics. When athletes make a mistake with it, from my experience, they really lean back with the posture. So where it requires the most coaching with the straight-legged bound is making sure they're upright and not leaning back, and then striking underneath their hips, basically on the ball of the foot. So that one is a push through the ground on the ball of the foot, perhaps a little bit different than a sprint bound, where a little bit more of the foot, you know, can be encouraged to contact the ground and roll through it a little bit.
Cool. I'm done there for the moment, Darren. I can come up with maybe another one, maybe.
No, I mean, yeah, we can talk all day.
So let's let other people answer or get their questions in.
Can I ask a quick question? And I think, Ken, you touched briefly on it. You talked about wickets. First of all, how high do you have the wickets? And when you did go through the presentation, you did say you did wickets for stride pattern. Now, my thoughts are that you can actually use wickets for stride cadence and also increments in strides as well. So, you know, not just set it up for a particular pattern, but you could use it for various stuff. So first of all, if you could tell me how high you normally have your wickets, then that would.
Yep. Yeah. So great question, Frank. Frankly, I could probably do another 20 minutes on that PowerPoint on wickets alone, but for brevity, I didn't go too much into details, but those are all, yeah, excellent questions. 6 inches, the smaller mini hurdles is the actual height of them. We do them, you know, really a couple different ways. As far as the run-in goes, if you guys are familiar with the Vince Anderson spacings, which are just freely available, you know, if you Google Vince Anderson wickets, you know, his stride patterns come up. It's typically the lead-in we do. Another American coach that kind of has a nice setup for wickets is Ron Grigg at Jacksonville University in America. So if you just look up his stride patterns, he's got some different variations on those. The way we specifically have done it is that we'll, you know, as I kind of mentioned in the presentation and then was talking about with Aston there, we'll pre-test our athletes in a normal year, not COVID, but in a normal year, you know, September for us is the beginning of our off season. We'll pre-test our athletes, you know, we'll just do 60 meters. This is for all of our speed and power athletes. We'll get automated segment times from 0 to 30, 30, 40, 40, 50, 50, 60. And we'll get get what their top speed is. Typically, we'll take the 30 to 40 or 40 to 50 segment. We have that filmed with our just simple iPad is good enough at 240 frames per second. From that, we can calculate step rate, step length, and, you know, with a pretty reasonable degree of accuracy, ground contact and flight times. So we enter into our, you know, final fall training cycle knowing what our athletes' metrics are at top speed, just the simple ones, stride rate, length, contact flight time, and leg length. And then what we'll do is for wickets, we use the Vince Anderson approach patterns for how they get into the wickets, but we set up like 4, 5, 6 lanes on the track, similar to you saw in our video. And we'll steer our athletes so that the end of the wicket run, and we'll work out 14, 16, 18 wickets, so that the end of that run is basically equivalent to what their stride length is when they're just running what we call a free run, you know, out of the wickets, or slightly less, maybe like 90 to 95%, that the stride pattern at the end of the wickets is maybe like 95 to 97% of what it is normally. That's what we're doing for just working on their mechanics. I'm going to address the stride frequency aspect in a second, Frank, because that's a great point. So we're just kind of generally working on the mechanics and saying, hey, how can we encourage good mechanics while running at fast speeds? That's the way we'll set it up. And we found it even for like our freshmen who maybe haven't done wickets before, you know, even by 4 weeks of practice, they can execute it pretty well. And our returners who've done it before, they can execute it really well. Absolutely, switching subjects, and Frank, to your second question, absolutely you can do it for other purposes and do it effectively. So, you know, you can have an athlete take in, you know, you can set them at shorter spacings and have them try to keep up a cadence, you know, still run fast, but at a faster frequency with a purposefully constrained stride length. You can do something that mimics what's called the drum drill with basically you know, and I haven't done this, so I don't want to speak from personal experience here, but I know it's done, where the athlete does a very fast run in and then has to essentially shorten the stride shorten the stride length to run in the wickets, but at a very high frequency. There's things that we're working on, you know, with some 400-meter athletes, and this is outside the realm of this audience, but working on frequency and fatigue by shortening the wicket length. So I find wickets to be a very interesting way to manipulate those two variables. And yeah, Frank, basically to tie a bow on that and answer your question, I think you can do it effectively to work on frequency if an athlete has a frequency that you would deem suboptimal optimal for the speed you're trying to hit. Yeah, I guess what I presented on more generally is the way we set them up, for our team on the larger whole. So does that make sense? Does that answer your question, Frank?
Yeah, it answers the question. Can I just ask one last question?
Yeah,
Dan?
sure.
I know with most presentations, sprint presentation, people tend to work on the lower body and no one ever actually focuses on the upper body. Do you actually have any drills, any exercises you do with your arms at all?
I'm going to give you somewhat a counterintuitive and against the grain answer. Nope. Don't spend that much time coaching it. I think that, the level of importance I give to the arm action is that it needs to be matching the legs, and that, you need to be getting similar ranges of motion in similar positions of what the legs are doing. And, Darren and I talked about this leading up to today's presentation. I mean, the stretch reflex that's going on there is going to, shoulders and hips directly mimic each other just from a anatomical standpoint in many ways. You're going to see many similar things there. I think that the job of the arms, to generally speaking, is to counterbalance the legs and to serve as a counterbalance from an angular momentum standpoint, to get very heavily into the biomechanics of it. I feel like the arms give you a very good window of insight as to what's going on in the lower body. So if you see somebody that's got something going on funky, for lack of a better word, in the upper body, to me, that is a clue that there's something that needs to be addressed. I always actually, in that case, would look downstream at what's going on with the legs, pelvis, etc., as to why that athlete is using the arms as a rudder to counterbalance the legs. But no, at the risk of, I guess, being counterintuitive, I'll say that I don't do that much as far as upper body work. That's not to say you shouldn't, as far as what they're doing, with the jump, with the actual part of the jump. But for top speed mechanics, that hasn't been a big, that has not been a big part of the research, or, just speaking to what we do with USATF, that has been a very small part of what we've done for top speed. So sorry,
Okay,
I don't have a good answer, but that's the honest answer.
Yeah,
So,
thanks for that.
Yeah.
So like the discussion that Ken and I were having preparation for this, it was really looking at you talked about in your presentation, the extension and the opening up of the elbow and the back wing. And you also kind of reference Tom Tellez's book, and in his book he talks about the extension of the kind of moment arm, increasing force, which then increases force on the opposing leg. So if you talk about your two-mass model research that you've done, and you've just said that you've not done any, there isn't any research, but is there some kind of longevity, or is this an area that we can look at where the use of that arm, and whether it's, we've got a tight 90-degree or an extension, and looking at the force applied on the opposing leg?
So Darren, that's such a great research question. And I guess that's why I always couch it as, I want the arms to mimic the legs. I'm always hesitant when I wear my researcher hat, and this is kind of against the Tellez book, because obviously there's a lot in a Tellez book on the role of the arm action, which is why I gave a caveat to my answer to Frank that it's kind of a counterintuitive answer. I always want the arm mechanics to mimic the legs they should be working through big ranges of motion. I do think that the emphasis needs to be in the same place as far as what's going on at the shoulder. I've become slightly less concerned with what's going on at the elbow over the last couple of years, just seeing a lot of guys run fast, both in our lab at SMU and just, like the DeGrasse with his funky chicken elbow, like that sort of thing. So just, as far as like specific corrections that I would make, no, I think globally you want to see, the same mirroring of the arms and the legs. Darren, that's a research question we'll put on our to-do list. Can the arms affect change in the legs? That's not my current thinking per se, but I think it's a reasonable thought, just given what, along the lines of the Tellez book and what's going on, the mirroring of contralateral arms and limbs. That's probably the best way I can wrap my head around it presently. So.
Cool. Thanks for that.
I've got a question.
Go for it, John.
I
Yeah,
can.
sorry. Go ahead, John.
With your technical flies, which we call in and outs or
Yep.
change of pace, what type of distances do you range? Yeah. And do you ever mix up your small hurdles and your technical flies?
Awesome question. So we typically go up to 70 meters with our, one thing I didn't picture here was sprint float sprints, ins and outs, sprint float sprints, right? So I showed a technical fly, which is, build up, fly zone, decel, somewhat similar in nature. We'll also do a 30-meter hard excel. 30 to 50 is, the float zone, really ins and outs, exactly like you're describing. And then we'll go 50 to 70, as our sprint. So sprint 0 to 30, float 30 to 50, sprint 50 to 70. Have we mixed in wickets with that? No. Have we mixed in wickets and then had a hard runoff period, just after the wicket that we're timing, like from 35 to 50 meters? Yeah, definitely. To try to see that the athlete can transfer the mechanics from the wickets to, what they're doing in their normal runoff period, basically, that the mechanics don't die out when they're in the wickets to, up through 30 meters or up through 35 meters. And then when they hit 35 meters and now they're sprinting free from 30 to 50, 35 to 50, that it just doesn't start to, all go to hell, basically. So I really love that. I've never done, a sprint float sprint or an in and out where you mix in maybe like the wickets in the middle of that.
Yeah.
To me, that's a really cool idea, though. Like if the float part was wicket run, I wouldn't see anything wrong with that for sure. I mean, maybe that's a great way to enforce good mechanics at a slightly less than maximal speed.
Yeah.
In fact, John, I might steal that for one of our wicket practices next fall.
I've done it in the past for runways where I want them into the middle part of the runway so that where they get their transition, where they can hit a higher optimum speed and then hold and find the board.
Yep. No, I think that's a great idea. And I don't want my tenor guys to be that, hey, wickets are the end all be all. There's a lot of better coaches than me that don't believe in them. I think that Boo Schnecksnyder does not like wickets. And so, a lot of great coaches don't use wickets. If you're one of those coaches that doesn't, I think there's arguments to be made for both. I do personally think that they are helpful for affecting change in athletes that perhaps just have a technique pattern that's hard, in concrete, and it's challenging to get them to make a change. I think wickets can be very effective then. So just to kind of put that, context around it. So.
Okay. The other question as well is, if we're talking front side mechanics, and when the foot goes into extension, what is it you want to see from your athletes when you're teaching someone how to strike the ground?
Yeah, great question again. Aiming for dorsiflexed, although that's not really going to happen. I mean, in the last few milliseconds of prior to ground contact, everybody just naturally plantar flex it, or most people naturally plantar flex at the last instant, right? With some of our fastest sprinters, the heel's going to touch the ground during the ground contact phase. And on some, like you look at Bolt, it can differ step to step, or Coleman, it can differ step to step. I think it's all about what the intent is. And then, seeing how much that aligns with what's actually going on. The way I coach it, ball of the foot, stiff ground contact, try to aim to be underneath your hip. 2/3 of that don't really, may not happen because they're always going to be slightly out in front of their foot after the second. They're always going to be slightly out in front of their hips after the second step. And, the foot will naturally plantar flex if you watch it in very slow motion. But the intent is to be, dorsiflex, balls of the foot underneath the hips. To me, that's the easiest way to cue it with a stiff ground contact.
So with that, what happens if you've got someone who naturally pronates, and you've got that problem?
Yeah. So I would, first of all, be looking at video from multiple angles, like it sounds like you are, which is a great thing. I would identify if it's just a one leg strength and stability issue as opposed to a running technique issue. To me, this is where perhaps some of these metrics that we talked about at the very end of the presentation, like the one leg hops, but now starting to get some metrics on that, could be worth looking into. So in other words, maybe it's not just a coaching or a cueing thing while they're on the track. Maybe it's some sort of strength and stability issue, just while they're on one leg in general, one leg hopping, and they don't have the intrinsic strength and stability in the foot and lower leg to support body weight or to do so quickly. I mean, pronation is a collapsing type of movement. Some is good, but more is not better, to be sure. So my first thought would be actually to look off the track to see if there's some sort of weakness or instability there. And then if everything checked out, then it's, going to have to figure out some other way to cue it or work on it. Or maybe you view it, as not a problem. I guess that would, the one other step back I would say is, are they overpronating and have excessively long ground contact times, that sort of thing, to the point where you view it as a problem, first and foremost.
Thank you.
Darren, I know we started late and we're going way late. I'm happy to sit here and talk shop all day, but I don't want to overrun my time either. So.
Well, listen, I mean, I think I'm more than happy continuing. If you guys are, we will have a break and we'll go into breakouts for where we can either look at some technical videos or get the lead coaches to maybe reflect and discuss some of the key things from the presentation from them. But I'm more than open to open it up to the audience, just if they want to continue with questions. Athletes, if there's anyone out there who have just reflections, some things that kind of resonated with you through the presentation, or any questions for Ken at the moment, your chance now.
Those have been great questions. I would expect nothing less. Yeah.
Okay. Aston, you said you had a few questions. Do you have anything else, or you're on mute, buddy? Still on mute. You're still on mute.
It may not be working.
I'll see if I can. No, we can't hear you. Can't hear you. There we go.
I think I've probably clicked the right button now. Yes.
Yes.
Good. No, I said no. I don't have any more questions as such. I mean, because I think Frank and John has kind of like taken up some of the things that I was probably thinking of. Just to sort of say, Ken, that I'm one of those coaches who don't use wickets or try not to.
Yeah. Look, a lot of great ones don't.
No, I just don't know enough about them. I see other people using them, and so far I've been reasonably successful in not using them. But yeah, no, and I understand. Loads of great coaches uses them, so I know that. It's just my preference. So
no, agreed. I think it's an interesting topic, as we said. I think a lot of great coaches use them. There's a lot of great coaches that don't. In my opinion, they're a good tool in the toolbox, and they're good to affect change in athletes who you perhaps are otherwise struggling to get them to make changes in their mechanics. If there's an athlete that has bad posture, bad hip position, bad backside mechanics, and whatever verbal instruction or demonstration instruction isn't working, then perhaps it's it can be an effective strategy. I certainly think there's many roads lead to Rome in everything, as with top speed development.
Yeah. I think the key thing for me with the wickets is you mentioned that it's very much targeted, and it's set up for the individual. So having lines of athletes all running over the same spacings, for me, it just doesn't make sense. So if you need 5 lanes with 60 hurdles set up just for those 5 athletes, and then depending on how you want to transition them through the warm up, you may want to evolve them. But I think the fact is that it has to be very targeted, and it's designed for that specific outcome, whether it's a constraint, a task constraint to get the desired outcome, or yeah, however you want.
Yeah, for transparency, I mean, it can be a pain in the butt to do it correctly with five lanes and get them set up. But yeah, no, I think they serve a purpose for some athletes. So,
all right, final round call before we go for a break.
Great. Well, yeah,
Hey,
yeah. Go ahead.
Let me just jump in there. Right? Look, athletes, right, understand, right, that in the breakout, you're not going to be able to talk to Ken. So if you've got a question, don't ask me later on. You've got Ken in front of you now.
Dominic, you had your hand up there, mate.
Yeah, Ken, you talk a lot about stiffness, and obviously a soft ankle joint acts as a shock absorber. At the other end of the leg, have you done any work or had any thoughts about the core strength also being an unwanted softness and a preferred stiffness, and then that may in turn link into a connection to the shoulders and the elbows?
Yeah, so awesome question, as these all have been. When we teach, like in our undergrad biomechanics class, we always talk about the core as anything that connects trunk, lumbar spine, pelvis, femur, basically. You know, with our undergrad students, we joke it's not just somebody having good body composition and a six-pack at the beach. So absolutely, Dominic, is what I'm saying. I mean, if there's any of that excessive compliance, if we're looking in a frontal plane and the pelvic stabilizers, and I had the one slide up there, but this is a great chance to go into it in more depth. I see, an excessive compliance happening a fair amount in the frontal plane because the pelvic stabilizers, glute med, et cetera, can't maintain pelvic stability upon initial ground contact. And to your point, that's not going to be optimal. So that is what I would view an up the chain lack of stability that's going to prolong ground contact and certainly be suboptimal. To me, there's a huge connection between that and what we're doing in our plyometrics and our weight room work, because unilateral strength is just so important to speed, especially in our female athletes. I think that sometimes that we'll see that as an area of room for improvement of weakness. I think that some of the Bosch drills are over the top. I find value in a lot of Bosch concepts, and others, I think the application of such is a little bit much. Sorry for those who are one side of the fence or the other with Bosch, but I love like the hip lock type of stuff. I think that is very valuable as far as being able, what we're doing off the track or in track drills and how we strike the ground, and can we really stay stiff, not just foot, ankle, but all the way up the chain and then frontal plane through the pelvis for so many reasons. Force application, if the free side of the pelvis, drops at any point, it's going to decrease the ability of the free limb to swing through rapidly. We've already talked through the thigh angular velocity piece. That's all interconnected to me. So yeah, so Dominic, I guess this is a very roundabout way of me saying core strength 100%, because I would, define core as anything that's related to trunk, lumbar spine, pelvis, and femur. And yeah, that frontal plane interaction of the pelvis and femur is key upon initial ground contact, and having the requisite amount of stiffness there is going to be a huge factor. Clearly for jumping, I mean, I don't think I need to tell this group the ability to transmit force from the ground up, and apply force through the board or through the ground during the jump part of it. It's going to be the same exact thing. But yes, I think that 100% translates to sprinting as well. So great question. Hopefully I answered that. And yes, I see that as hugely important. I see that as, we didn't talk a lot about weight room type of, exercises, drills, and part of that was outside the scope of the presentation today. I do see that as something that is very much can be addressed in the weight room, what we're doing as far as our unilateral exercises, either resistance training or plyometric. I view that as one of the best ways to address that. So.
Cool. I mean, the hip lock, the concept, or the Franz is kind of talking about that hip lock. I think in the same way the wickets, it's how you do that as well, how you carry that, how that's carried out as well. As I see people doing hip locks and popping their knee up. I'm like, it's so soft. And you talk about intensity and intent. Hitting that hip lock and that stiffness in that position is really key when we're employing that within a training. But that's probably
100%. I mean, it's everything, right? At the risk of saying the obvious, it's not just the drill. It's all about how the drill is executed, or the concept, right? But yes, of course, I agree with that, Darren. Yep.
Awesome.
Andrew, do you have a question? Or no? Oh, okay. Sorry.
I do. I'll go on.
Yeah. Oh, Alexander. Okay.
Yeah. So currently, I'm having an issue with knee lift, as my coach will know. So I was sort of so when I first started to do long jump, I had an issue with flicking my lower limb out. Below the knee. So over the past couple of years, I've started to shorten my stride length, to almost try and increase the ground contact time, try and decrease the ground contact time. And I'm having an issue now where I'm sort of struggling with whether I'm cutting my stride length, and basically just cycling over. And so my question really is, in terms of ground contact time and knee lift, which would you say is, obviously they're both vital, but which would you say is the best to work on?
All these questions are so good. So frontside mechanics and knee lift is important as a mechanism for applying force. So we don't want to just lift our knees just to lift our knees. I mean, it's not about running pretty per se. It's about having good posture and good frontside mechanics so we don't get hurt. And so we can apply a lot of force to get to those short ground contact times, to get to those fast speeds. So the direct answer to your question, Alexander, which is a great question, is the more important metric is force application and ground contact time. The knee lift in front of you is a means to that end, basically. If you're curious about where your stride length is and whether or not you've cut it too short, I would say a really good metric to use is that for the speeds that you want to hit as a horizontal jumper would be, you probably need to have a stride length that's 2.3 times your leg length. 2.3 times your leg length. So for elite male sprinters, that's typically about 2.5 times leg length. For jumpers, since your top speeds aren't going to be quite that of sprinters, you probably need to be 2.3, give or take. For most males, how tall are you, Alexander? Just roughly.
Yeah, 6'2".
So you're 1.8 plus meters. Is that
180,
right?
185, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to break out my calculator real quick. So you're 1.85. Leg length is usually 53% of standing height, give or take a little bit. I'm guessing your leg length is around 0.98 meters. I mean, it's close to 1 meter, right? So you're going to want to be, your stride length should probably be about 2.25 meters for you to hit the speeds that you want. So, and that's a rough approximation just done through Zoom without ever having seen you in person or seen you run, of course. But if you're watching video or if you're doing a top speed test or just, evaluating what your stride length is, I think, one way you could potentially evaluate if your stride length is too short is by measuring it through video analysis or otherwise, and then saying, hey, am I well below 2.25 meters? Because if you're well below that, then you might be out of range. You might have, cut it down to the point where, it's too short. I want to be very cautious with that recommendation. Since I have not seen you, I don't know your body, your injury history, everything else. So, don't take that as gold standard recommendation. I'm just saying that's one way you can go about it, is knowing that for, jumpers to attain the speeds that you need, you probably need to have a stride length of roughly 2.3 times your leg length. Does that make sense, Alexander? And
It
again,
does,
I don't
yes.
want you to rush to your coach and say, hey, Ken Clark said, you need to have this, and if you're not doing this, everything's wrong. No, that's just one way of analyzing if you're in the ballpark of where your stride length needs to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great
Thank you.
disclaimer there. Excellent. Well, listen, I think it's 10 past.
Yeah, no, I know we've gone way over. So
Listen,
yeah,
this has been fantastic. So, and I'm sure everyone will have taken copious notes anyways. If there aren't any further questions, can I suggest that we take 10 minutes? That'll allow people to get a comfort break, grab a coffee and a chocolate digestive, whatever you want to have. And we'll come back at 20 past 4, and then I'll put everyone into the groups. Ken has just popped his email address in the chat box. So if anyone has any direct questions, I'm assuming, Ken, you're happy for people to reach out.
Yeah, feel free to, as I said, reach out to me through email. And I also put a caveat on, I'm really slow with email response time sometimes, but yeah, just shoot me an email and I'll get back to you. Anything that comes up after, either you think about our presentation more today or in chat groups or whatever else, be happy to get back to you. So, and I'm sure you can funnel the questions to Darren as well. So.
Yeah. Mate, that's been fantastic. It's been a pleasure listening to you again, and it's been great, fielding the questions really well. So on behalf of the athletes and the coaches in the session, thank you very much again, mate. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you guys again. Appreciate the time and attention. Hopefully you got something out of it. As you could tell, I could talk speed all day, and hopefully you guys have a good rest of the session.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, man.
All right, thanks guys.
Thanks.
Okay, 20 past. I'll see you in 10 minutes.
Darren, you want to stay on just real quick?
Yeah, we can do that.
Darren, I'm going to have to head off to go and actually train today.
Okay, Sam.
Is there any information going forward about anything else at the moment that would be said at the end of the meeting, or just don't want to miss anything?
So 2 really things. There will be an email coming out. There's an offer of a free Kukri t-shirt for everyone. So I'll send you information how you can access that.
Okay.
Commonwealth Games selection policy will be out shortly.
Oh, cool.
And we will be doing an online session on the 14th of April to go through the selection policy and give people that. So that time is going to give people a chance to read the policy and then come online and pose any questions to me around, what does that mean for getting nominated for selection, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And there will be kind of plans. We will be kind of presenting proposed plans for the next 12 months. Hopefully less online engagement and more face-to-face stuff. But yeah, that's pretty much it, Sam.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for today as well, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Sam.
Appreciate it.
Cool. Happy with that?
Yeah, I thought it went well. More important question is, are you happy with that?
Yeah. Listen, I made loads of notes on it, and you covered all the points really well. I think it links. I mean, Frank's still on the call just now, but it links really well to the messaging that we've presented previously. But with Frank, Aston, and myself over the summer, we've also been presenting on the long jump and the triple jump, the phase analysis, and kind of reinforced by, I suppose, the biomechanical underpinning stuff. So you've just give us the gold standard of that kind of messaging, which kind of it's just really, really important on that. So yeah, really good.
Great, appreciate it. I felt bad on the arms question, Frank. So the background on that is, I didn't I guess I didn't want to present anything that was that didn't align with your guys' messaging. We have been, I've had a lot of conversations with Ralph Mann about this, and then we also have some emerging research from our lab, which is basically saying, not saying that the arms aren't important, because that's the wrong message. That's not the correct message, but just that they, kind of what I said, which is, they are important from a counterbalancing type of thing. And so I guess, I just wanted to answer the question honestly, at the risk of not aligning with what, with other message. But yeah, we have started to address them less, for transparency with the USATF sprint model, like Ralph's biomechanical model, the arms actually, I mean, they're on the little stick figure, but they don't actually, our sprinters don't even actually really receive much instruction on arm action. Now, what's interesting cause and effect of that is, you know, perhaps, Darren, and I think this is your point, if you give somebody, if somebody's struggling with the leg cue and you give them an arm cue and that serves to, you know, that athlete processes it and it serves to cause a change in their legs, clearly that's a great thing, you know? And so I was trying to straddle that middle ground, you know, if I'm just strictly wearing my biomechanics researcher hat, it's a challenge, only because we don't have any direct evidence yet that you know, of the arms contributing to that. I think maybe the arm effect on the 2-mass model is our next research question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We did some work with the arms many years ago with one of my athletes where the legs were not moving as quick as I thought they could. And we started developing some exercises on the arms. Right. Just how to move the arms very quickly. And within time, obviously, it wasn't, I didn't collect any data, but I could see a massive improvement using
but just arms. Observationally, you saw an improvement. I mean, I think the key thing that we all know is, hey, athletes process cues differently, right? Some cues work for some athletes and they don't work for others. And of course, it's always about finding what works for your athlete. So even if the biomechanist in me says, well, I'm not sure what the arms role is, the coach in me will always say, hey, whatever works. If the athlete needs to hear an arm cue to get an improvement in what the legs are doing, I mean, gosh, go with it, you know? So anyway, so Darren, I apologize if that answer was a little.
No, that's fine. And one of the things we see also with the jumpers, especially the triple jumpers, they do ask questions about what should my arms be doing. And I always come back, the first thing I would say, unless it's really drastically bad, I would just say the arms are for balancing. That's what they are there for, and purely for balancing. But just before we finish, so when did you start at SMU? Because I've been to SMU, Aston and I have been to SMU twice. Do you know Ted McLaughlin? Was it before your time?
Might have been. I was there from 2010 to 2015.
Okay, so Ted was back there in the 80s.
Before.
Well, was one of our great jumpers.
Ken, were you born at that point, Ken?
No, it wasn't.
I was born in 1980, so.
Okay, so you wouldn't know Ted McLaughlin. You had a bunch of really good athletes. There was Mike Carter, Bob Ware. Keith broke the world indoor record for triple jump. So you had, all of a sudden, you had a really good batch of people.
There's so much talent down there. We always used to joke in the lab at SMU. It's like you could walk out, throw a quarter into the street, and you'd hit somebody that could break 10-3 in a 100-meter dash. There's just that much athleticism in that area. So, anyways, well, Darren, we can debrief. You know, I know you guys got to take a quick break and then move on. Darren, why don't we just circle back through email, or we can do it. We'll do another Zoom prior to that upcoming one. But thanks again, man. This was a blast. So I really appreciate it. So
fantastic, mate. Listen, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
All right. Cheers. Thanks. Bye. You too. Bye-bye.